They were still laughing when the first vehicle pulled into the parking lot. It had started at 11:08 on a Sunday morning, outside the doors of Bethel AME Church on Glenwood Avenue in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, in the middle of the summer's worst heat, when the congregation was coming out in their good clothes, and the air smelled of cut grass, and someone's cologne from 30 feet away. The man had been standing on the church steps with his jacket over one arm and a Bible in his hand. He was not running. He was not shouting. He was not doing anything except standing in the shade of the church awning, waiting for a woman named Constance, who was his grandmother, and who moved slowly because of her right hip, and because she had learned long ago that the world could wait for her. The two officers had pulled up on the sidewalk, not the street. One of them, stocky badge number that would later appear on two separate incident reports as Harlow D., had come up the steps two at a time. His partner stayed near the car, one hand resting on the door. "Hey, you! Come down from there." The man on the steps looked at him. He was 43 years old, which you would not have guessed because he looked younger. And he had the kind of stillness about him that people who don't know better sometimes mistake for submission, but that people who do know better recognize immediately as something else entirely. He held the jacket over his arm. He held the Bible. He did not come down. "Sir," he said, "is there a problem?" "There's been a complaint. Someone matching your description was in this parking lot earlier making threats. I've been inside this church since 9:45 this morning. I can give you the names of 40 people who will confirm that. Come down from the steps." "I'm waiting for my grandmother. She's—" Harlow moved up the last two steps and put his hand on the man's arm. What happened next lasted 6 seconds. The man did not raise his voice. He did not pull away. He set his Bible down on the step behind him with the particular care of someone who has learned to set precious things down, rather than drop them, and he turned his palms out, and he said, very clearly, "I am not resisting, I am complying." He said it loudly enough for the people on the church steps to hear, because he understood, had always understood, in the way that certain men are required to understand from a young age, that witnesses are the only record that survives when everything else disappears. Harlow cuffed him anyway. He cuffed him and walked him down the steps and put him against the hood of the patrol car and said something to his partner, and the partner laughed. Not loudly, not with malice, just the casual laugh of two people who have done this enough times that the weight of it no longer lands in the same place it used to. The congregation was on the steps. Constance was at the door, both hands on the frame, not understanding yet what she was seeing. A deacon named Obina had his phone out. A woman in a green and gold head tie had her hand pressed flat against her chest. Nobody moved toward the car. They had all lived long enough to know that moving toward the car was its own kind of danger. The Bible was still on the top step, face down on the concrete, closed. The spine was cracked in one place from years of opening, and the cover had a small water stain near the bottom left corner from a morning 12 years ago, when it had been left out in a downpour. It had belonged to his mother. He had not known, standing there on the steps, that he would not pick it up himself. What the officers did not know, what neither of them had any reason to know, on a Sunday morning in July outside a church in Englewood, was that the black SUV that had followed the patrol car into the parking lot belonged to a man named Chief Warrant Officer Kweku Owusu Boateng. And that Kweku was not alone. His name was Sergeant First Class Adebayo Kolada Mensah. He was 43 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, and he weighed 211 pounds, which was 4 pounds less than his operational weight because he had been eating poorly for the last 6 weeks, while his unit was between deployments, and he always ate poorly between deployments because the structure that kept him eating regularly was the same structure that kept him pointed at a purpose, and without the one the other tended to drift. He smelled of church and a cedar deodorant and the faint specific sourness that comes from a man who sweated through his good shirt on the walk from the parking lot and whose good shirt was now under Harlow's hand against the hood of a patrol car. His shoes were black and plain and polished. His trousers were dark navy, pressed. He had ironed them himself that morning at 6:15, before Constance was awake, because ironing before church was the one ritual his mother had required of him from the age of 8, and that he had never stopped performing, partly from habit and partly from something he could not name, that was closer to love than obligation. He had grown up 4 blocks from this church. The house was gone now, torn down in 2014 and never replaced. Just a rectangle of pale grass where a foundation had been. But the block was the same block, and the smell of it in summer was the same smell. And the Deacon Obinna had been at this church since Adebayo was 7 years old, and had once, in 1994, driven him to a track meet in Evanston in a car with no air conditioning and a back window that wouldn't close all the way, and had spent the entire drive telling him that every gift you are given is also a responsibility, which Adebayo had not understood until he was approximately 31, and then had not been able to stop thinking about since. His mother, Adunola Mensah, had sold akara and ogi from a thermos every Saturday morning in front of this church for 9 years, before her knees made the standing too much. She had given the thermos to Constance when she could no longer carry it, and Constance had used it for 2 more years. It was still in Constance's kitchen cabinet, the silver one with the red rubber seal that had never quite closed flush after Adebayo's nephew sat on it in 2019. He had joined the Army at 18, 2 weeks after graduating from Fenger High School, because his mother had looked at what was available and what he was capable of, and had said, very quietly, that the Army would take what he had and make it useful. She had been right, as she was right about most things. He had been useful in ways and places that he was not permitted to discuss in detail, which his grandmother Constance had long since accepted, and his mother had never quite stopped worrying about, and which he himself thought about as rarely as possible. Because thinking about it in any depth produced a specific kind of distance from the ordinary world that he had learned was better managed than examined. He had been home for 6 weeks. He was going back in 14 days. This Sunday was the one morning in the 6 weeks that he had attended church with Constance, because she had asked once, and he had said yes, and his word was the one currency he had never allowed to depreciate. The goal of his Sunday morning had been simple: church, then breakfast at Valois on 53rd Street, where Constance liked the eggs, then back home so she could watch her program at 1 o'clock. That was everything. It had been a complete plan. It had taken Harlow D approximately 40 seconds to dismantle it. He was thinking about this precisely and without emotion, in the way he thought about problems in the field. Not what it meant, but what it required, when the black SUV turned into the parking lot and pulled up 6 feet from the patrol car. The door opened. Kweku Owusu-Boateng stepped out first. Kweku was 38. He was Adebayo's second in command, and had been for 4 years, which meant he was also the person who had Adebayo's location, at all times, on a Sunday in July in Chicago, because that was a habit of care that the unit had developed and maintained regardless of whether they were operational. He had a phone call, made at 11:11 from a member of the congregation who had Kweku's number, from a neighborhood barbecue 2 summers ago. The call had lasted 45 seconds. Kweku had made 1 call of his own after that. Then he had driven. He was not in uniform. He was in a white linen shirt and dark trousers, and he stood next to the SUV with his arms at his sides, and looked at the patrol car and at Harlow, and at Adebayo's hands flat on the hood without expression. If you are already feeling what I think you are feeling, stay with me, because what comes out of that vehicle in the next moment is something this story has been building toward, from the first second, and something neither officer was prepared to see. Then the second door opened, and the third, and the fourth. They came out in the quiet, specific way that men come out of vehicles when they have decided exactly what they are doing and have no need to discuss it further. Staff Sergeant Dubem Achebe, Sergeant Tobias Nwosu, Sergeant First Class Nnamdi Okafor, who was 6'4" and had a scar along his left forearm from Helmand Province, and moved the way large men move when they have learned that size is most effective when it is still. Corporal James Owusu, who was the youngest of them at 29 and who had nonetheless been in 2 theaters, and who had, at this moment, his hands clasped in front of him and his chin level, looking at the patrol car with the studied calm of a man who learned young that calm was the most powerful thing you could bring to a situation where someone expected you to be anything else. 6 of them, 7 with Kweku. Each of them had been somewhere that had no name on any civilian map. Each of them had sat in a vehicle in a different kind of dark than this parking lot, and waited for a different kind of signal than a phone call from a neighbor. They had trained together for a total of 11 years, across 4 different units, and had been this particular configuration for the last 3. And in those 3 years, they had developed the specific fluency of people who have tested each other under conditions that reveal everything. You learn fast who a person is when what they do or don't do has real consequences. There were no performances in this unit. There was no posturing. There was only the work, and who showed up for it, and how. Adebayo had been the one constant. He was the reason Dubem had re-enlisted in 2021 when his contract came up, and his mother had asked him to come home, and he had spent 2 weeks in a state of genuine uncertainty before driving back to base and signing the paperwork. He was the reason Nnamdi had gotten through the thing in 2022, that none of them discussed by name but that all of them referenced obliquely when the situation called for it, which it occasionally did, in the quiet way that units develop their own language for the weight they carry. He was the reason Kweku had turned his vehicle around on a Sunday morning and made one phone call, and driven to Englewood without fully explaining to himself why. Because explanations were not the unit's language. Presence was the unit's language. Showing up was the sentence. They did not move toward the car. They stood in a loose semicircle near the SUV, which was parked perpendicular to the patrol vehicle. And they were quiet. That was all. They were simply there, in the parking lot of Bethel AME Church on Glenwood Avenue. 7 men in civilian clothes standing still in the July heat, and the weight of their presence reorganized everything around it the way a stone reorganizes water. Officer Harlow had turned. His partner had turned. Constance, still at the door, had both hands clasped now and her lips were moving. Obinna's phone was still up. Kweku looked at Harlow. He did not raise his voice. "What is the charge?" he said. Harlow looked at the 7 men. He looked at Adebayo's hands on the hood. He looked back at Kweku. "There was a complaint. What is the charge?" A pause. "We're investigating a complaint." "Is he charged with anything?" Harlow's partner said quietly. Harlow looked at his partner. He looked at the 7 men again. He looked at Adebayo. Something moved through his face that was not quite an emotion, and not quite a decision, but was the space between the two, where a person is calculating something faster than they can articulate it. "What unit?" he said. He said it to Kweku. Kweku said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Does that change what you do next?" The question sat in the air above the parking lot for 3 full seconds. It was Adebayo who spoke. His hands were still on the hood. His voice was level and very clear. "I'd like to pick up my Bible," he said. "It's on the top step. It belonged to my mother." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Harlow reached down and unlocked the cuffs. Adebayo straightened up. He adjusted the sleeves of his shirt. He walked to the steps and picked up the Bible and held it the way he always held it. Not displayed, not tucked away, but carried in the left hand at his side, which was how his mother had always carried hers. He turned back to the parking lot. He looked at Harlow. He looked at the partner. He looked at Kweku and the 6 men behind him. He said to Harlow, "There was no complaint, or if there was, it was called in about a black man standing on church steps in his good clothes, waiting for his grandmother, and whoever called it in knew exactly what would happen when you arrived." Harlow said nothing. "I'm not going to report you," Adebayo said. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because the paperwork will go into a system, and the system will process it, and in 8 months, someone will send me a letter saying the matter was reviewed and no action was taken, and I have done enough work in my life to know exactly how that goes. So I'm not going to do that." He paused. "I'm going to ask you one question, one. And I want you to think about it tonight when the shift is over and you're somewhere quiet." He looked at Harlow directly, without anger, the way a man looks at someone he is choosing to believe is capable of better. "If you had come up those steps and seen a white man in good clothes holding a Bible and waiting for his grandmother, would you have put him on the hood of your car?" Harlow said nothing. "That's the question," Adebayo said. "That's the only question." He nodded to Kweku. He turned and walked back up the steps to Constance, who had both her small hands on his arm the moment he reached her, and whose eyes were very bright, and who said nothing at all, which was how Constance expressed the things that did not fit in words. He picked up her purse from the step where she had set it down and offered her his arm, and they walked together toward the parking lot, slowly, at her pace, because her hip was her hip and the world could wait. Kweku and the unit watched them go. Then Kweku looked at the two officers one more time, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with the flat, clear regard of someone confirming something they already knew, and got back in the SUV. The doors closed. The vehicle pulled out. The officers stood in the parking lot for a moment. The congregation was still on the steps. The deacon Obinna had lowered his phone. Harlow's partner said very quietly, "What unit do you think that was?" Harlow did not answer. He got in the car. He sat with his hands on the wheel for a moment before he started the engine. He looked at the steps where the Bible had been. He started the engine. He drove. That evening at 6:44 p.m., Harlow's partner, whose name was Caruso, and who had been on the force for 7 years, and who had never, in those 7 years, had a reason to question the shape of a Sunday morning call, sat in the precinct locker room and typed a search into his personal phone. He typed the description of what he had seen in that parking lot. The way they had stood. The way they had gotten out of the vehicle. The stillness of them. He did not find the unit. He found enough to understand that what he had been standing across from in that parking lot was not something he had been trained to read correctly. He sat with his phone for a long time. He did not show the results to Harlow. He put his phone in his pocket and changed out of his uniform, and drove home and did not sleep well. In the 6 weeks that followed, he requested on his own a transfer to community liaison. His supervisor approved it without asking why. He did not explain. There are decisions a person makes that do not require explanation, only the kind of accounting that happens internally, between a person and the version of themselves they were, before a Sunday morning in a parking lot reorganized something that couldn't be put back the way it was. They never filed the incident report on the complaint. The complaint had, as Adebayo had said, come from a neighbor 3 blocks away, who had called in a black man loitering outside a church. The neighbor had not used the word loitering. The neighbor had said, "Suspicious male, dark clothing, church parking lot." The dark clothing was Adebayo's good navy trousers and the pressed shirt that had been ironed at 6:15 that morning. The suspicious male had been standing in the shade of an awning, holding a Bible, waiting for a woman with a bad hip. No action was taken on the complaint. No action was needed. The complaint had already done the only thing it was designed to do, and had been stopped before it finished doing it, and the person who had made it would never know the names of the 7 men who had made the stopping possible. Adebayo and Constance ate breakfast at Valois at 12:30. She had the eggs. He had the oatmeal with brown sugar, which he ordered every time even though he found it disappointing every time, because his mother had always ordered it and old habits have a different relationship to logic than new ones. Constance talked about the sermon. She talked about Sister Adazi's new grandchild. She talked about the thermos in her cabinet, and how the seals still didn't close right, and whether it was worth having fixed or whether it was better to just know the leak was there and account for it. Adebayo listened to all of it. He asked questions. He laughed twice. He drank 3 cups of coffee. He did not talk about the parking lot. There was nothing in the parking lot that needed to become a conversation. It had been handled. What handling it had required was what he was trained to do, and what the 6 men behind him were trained to do, and what the unit had, in one form or another, been doing for years in places and under conditions that made a parking lot in Inglewood on a July Sunday seem very small and very manageable and very close to home. That was the thing none of them said, and all of them knew. This was close to home. This was a church on a street where some of them had grown up. This was a grandmother at a door. This was a Bible on a step. The distance between what happened in this parking lot and what happened in the other places where they had been required to be useful was, in certain lights, not a distance at all. It was the same question, asked from different directions. Who gets to stand somewhere without being required to justify their standing? Who gets to wait for their grandmother in peace? Who gets to hold a Bible and be left alone on a Sunday morning in their good clothes and their polished shoes in the neighborhood where they learned to iron a shirt before church at the age of 8? Nobody answered that question in the parking lot. Nobody needed to. 7 men in civilian clothes had answered it by being present, and the answer had been enough, and they had all gone home for lunch. There is a word in Yoruba, duro, that means to wait, but also to stand firm, and also simply to be present and also to hold your ground. And the boundaries between those meanings are not always clear because sometimes they are the same action. Adebayo Mensah had been standing on the church steps for 11 minutes when the officers arrived. He was holding a Bible that had belonged to his mother. He had been waiting for a woman who moved slowly. He had been doing exactly what he was doing, which was nothing, which was everything, which was the one thing a person should be able to do on a Sunday morning in front of a church, without being required to defend. Some people carry weight that was never theirs to carry, and carry it anyway. Some people go back to the neighborhoods that shaped them and stand in the places that remember them when the buildings are gone. Some people walk into rooms or parking lots or church steps where the room itself was not designed to hold them and hold their ground anyway, quietly, with their hands out, saying, "I am not resisting, I am complying," loudly enough for witnesses. You cannot always send 7 men. Most people who are put against the hood of a patrol car on a Sunday morning do not have a second in command with their location and a neighbor's phone number and the particular kind of loyalty that comes from having been useful together in the dark. Most people stand there alone. Most people comply and go home and sit at the kitchen table and try to decide whether to be angry or just tired. And most of the time they choose tired because tired is more sustainable. But here is what does not change. Here is what the parking lot does not alter, and the hood of the car does not alter, and the laugh that the partner laughed does not alter. The Bible on the step. The shirt ironed at 6:15, the grandmother's hand on his arm the moment he reached her. The oatmeal at Valois that was always disappointing and that he ordered every time anyway because some things are not about satisfaction. They are about continuity. About being the person who does the thing that was done before you. About the chain of small, ordinary acts that prove you are still here. They can disrupt a Sunday. They cannot take the Sunday. I want to ask you one question, and I want you to sit with it the way Adebayo asked Harlow to sit with his. If someone put you against the hood of a car in front of your church, in front of the congregation that watched you grow up, in front of your grandmother, and then walked away and got in their car and drove, would you need 7 men to arrive to know your own worth? Or would you already know? And if you already knew, where did that knowledge come from? Who gave it to you? And have you ever told them? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read everyone. If this channel is where you come when you need to remember that quiet dignity is its own kind of force, subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.